London, 1947. A saleroom at Christie's. On the tables lie the possessions of a dead prince. Furniture, paintings, porcelain. A crowd presses at the doors. The Daily Telegraph reports the turnout broke every previous record. Connoisseurs and onlookers want to see what is left of the Duke of Kent, auctioned off by his own widow. The sale is said to bring in £92,300 that day. Not out of a collector's whim, but because she needs the money. The wife of the king's brother stands in the sale room, selling what remained of her husband, piece by piece. How does it come to this? The story doesn't begin with a plane crash. It begins with a bill. 8 years earlier, Marina was the pride of the royal house. In 1934, the court brought her to Britain, Princess of Greece and Denmark, Russian blood, European glamour. They presented her as the modern face of the crown, an image that could be sold. 8 years later, the man who held that image together was dead. On paper, the House of Kent was secure. George had inherited part of the private fortune from his father, King George V. In 1939, the wealthy Princess Louise named him her chief heir. Her jewels she left to Marina, but George spent with both hands. And Marina came from Greek exile with almost no dowry. The glamour was real, the reserves less so. On August 25, 1942, Prince George's plane crashes in Scotland. The first British royal in over 450 years to die in service. The country mourns. The court keeps its composure. And in the same moment, something ends that no one names aloud. George drew an annuity from the civil list. £35,000 a year. With his death, it's gone, not cut. Cancelled. The bills remained. 2 households remained. 3 children remained. Only the income was gone. From his death on, his widow and his children had to live on something else. Not on what was theirs by right, but on what they were given out of grace. In 1952, the Member of Parliament William Waldorf Astor said it openly in the Commons. He called it an anomaly and asked the government to secure Marina 2/3 of the old sum. The government did nothing. The entitlement stayed ended. The grace remained. But one thing could not be hidden. If a man fell in the war, his family was often spared the death duty. But that exemption applied only to the lower ranks. For sailors, soldiers, ordinary airmen. For senior officers, it did not. George was an air commodore. The widow of an ordinary airman would have paid nothing. Marina paid the full duty on £157,735. Her husband's high rank did not protect her. It handed her the bill. 7 weeks before George's death, Marina had given birth to her 3rd child, Prince Michael. Now she sat there with 3 children, 2 households, and a tax debt. A house she had, Coppins in Buckinghamshire, inherited through George, 14 bedrooms. But a house is not an income. King George VI wanted to change that. In 1943, he pressed to secure Marina an income of her own at public expense. His private secretary recorded how the court responded. The man's name was Alan Lascelles. He and his colleague Hardinge called the plan disastrous. A rise would trigger a debate in Parliament and in public over the royal finances. That was exactly what the court feared more than anything. Churchill at first leaned toward following the king. Then he let himself be talked around. Lascelles called the idea of providing for her publicly, in his own words, an injustice. His argument, George had inherited almost $1 million from his father. The matter was settled. The court would not pay for her publicly. Not because there was no money, because providing for her was more dangerous than her hardship. What she received came privately and quietly. Queen Mary gave her an allowance from her own fortune. The children's school fees the family paid out of its own pocket. Help there was, but it came as a gift, never as a right. By some accounts, Marina kept her staff's wages low. She borrowed dresses from designers, wore them for one evening, and sent them back the next morning. The best-dressed woman in Europe borrowed her wardrobe. And then she sold. In 1947, Christie's opened its doors. People came in record numbers. Strangers pressed through the rooms to see what had belonged to a prince. Furniture, art, and porcelain went under the hammer. In 1962 came the second auction. This time, the Fabergé pieces. What George had collected in a lifetime, his widow broke up in stages. While she sold, she went on working. She took over her husband's offices. President of Wimbledon for 26 years. President of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. She represented the Queen abroad. In Ghana, when the country gained independence. In Botswana, she stood for the crown around the world. For the same crown that had decided, in an internal memo, not to provide for her. The king had wanted to help her. His own court called it folly. So she sold what remained of George, piece by piece, at Christie's, before record crowds.